Good morning and welcome back to my garden. My name's Adrienne. I live in Southern Michigan and this is the third weekly garden tour of the 2022 growing season. A lot of the zinnias outside the garden are budding. This bed is just going to be gorgeous. My dahlias are starting to bud. I know I probably should have pruned these. My milkweed is extremely happy. I had this plant in a pot the last 2 summers because I wasn't sure where I wanted to put it, and finally transplanted it early this spring. Now that we're at the end of June, everything is really starting to take off. Daylilies are blooming and looking fantastic. And the purple potted pole beans are really taking over this trellis. I had a big fabric pot full of onions that I didn't have room for at the time that I planted most of the onions in the garden. And when I ripped out the old spring crops from this bed, I plugged in a bunch of those onions and they're not looking super fantastic. I'm hoping that they will pull through. If they don't, it's a bummer, but it's not the end of the world. I have plenty of onions throughout the rest of the garden to store for the winter. So these are really just a bonus, but I would like them to do well. Cabbage is still doing pretty good. I haven't seen any cabbage worms yet. I have been spraying my brassicas with BT about every 2 weeks, just as a preventative approach. These are cosmos. I have 3 little clumps of cosmos here, and they just make me so happy. Peppers are doing good. A lot of the plants are starting to get little flower buds. This is some Genovese basil. And I know I've been saying this for 3 weeks now that this rosemary is going to move. I might do it, I might not. I do have a pot of rosemary. Maybe I'll put this one in a pot too. Brussels sprouts are doing good. And I have a bunch of curly kale still hanging on in here. I've been feeding a lot of the kale to the chickens. I know when the weather gets warm, it tends to get a little bitter. My bonus sunflower in the potato patch is doing great. And these Kennebec potatoes are pretty close to harvest. I would say within the next couple of weeks, these plants are going to start to die back. When potatoes are ready to harvest, the potato plants turn yellow and die back. Once that happens, you know that the potatoes are as big as they're going to get. You could harvest them once they flower, but you're just going to get small potatoes. If you wait until the plants die back, you'll have good-sized potatoes to store. This is a volunteer zinnia in this little strawberry patch. I've interplanted onions just about anywhere they would be happy in my garden. I've read that onions are a good companion plant for strawberries. My eggplants suffer a lot of flea beetle damage. It's just typical for my garden. And even though they're pretty riddled with bug damage, they do produce. This little mystery pepper is doing great. I've got a ground cherry peeking out of these violas. This is a cilantro plant that went to flower. And it has the most charming little flowers, and the pollinators just love it. I've got a few cilantro plants that I'm just leaving for the pollinators. My little patch of ground cherries at the end of this bed is coming along just as I had hoped. And these tomato plants that I transplanted last week are doing okay. They're still acclimating to their new living environment. And I'm noticing, oh my gosh, there's some cabbage worms. So here's my first encounter with cabbage worms this year. How gross. And you can see how they blend in so well with the color of this plant. And I have got several sizes of them, and this is so interesting because I looked on this plant the other day because I saw this damage starting and I didn't see any, but there's quite a few in there now that I can see. This is my first time ever having cabbage worms in my garden, believe it or not. But I haven't grown a lot of cabbage or brassicas before this year, and they are gross. Everything in this bed is doing really good. Last week I trimmed the tops of the onions, and that just puts a lot more energy into the bulbs, and I'm noticing a lot more growth in the bulbs since I've done that. The echinacea is starting to bud. And now that I've found cabbage worms in this bed, I'm going to take a good look through this curly kale, and I'll probably just pull it out just to be on the safe side. Purple sage is doing so good. Such a pretty plant. Calendula blooming. This is the flashback mix. I also have strawberry blonde calendula scattered throughout the garden. The sweet peppers are doing great. They're loving all of this hot weather. Starting to set some blossoms. These are Mexican sour gherkin cucumbers, cucamelons. I have some down here hiding behind these teddy bear sunflowers also. And these sugar magnolia peas are just so cute. It's a purple pod. My wild thyme in this bike basket is starting to flower, and I'm just gonna let it. And I got this little plant from the greenhouse. I don't know what it is. I just thought it was really pretty, and I'm hoping this wild thyme doesn't completely choke it out. I'll probably prune that back a little bit. We're getting to the tail end of the strawberry harvest, the first strawberry harvest. These are ever-bearing strawberries, so I will get another harvest this summer. This sweetheart tomato plant back here, it's a cherry tomato with heart-shaped tomatoes. I cannot wait to see them, and that's doing really well. My Alaskan salmon nasturtium is putting on a show, and I am so happy. I just love this little plant. And this is a purple ball basil with a little strawberry plant. My garlic will be ready to harvest in a couple of weeks. All of my paste tomatoes on this trellis are setting fruit. Pretty soon my garden will be loaded with flowers, and I'm so excited. The tomatillos have been battling some tiny little beetles. They're a little bigger than flea beetles, but they jump like flea beetles. And I've seen a couple of potato beetles on these. I've been dusting them with diatomaceous earth in the evening and then washing it off in the morning. But they are just loaded with blossoms. This is the first time I've ever grown tomatillos. This is a Wild Boar Farms blueberries cherry tomato and a sun gold tomato. And pretty much all of my tomato plants have been setting flowers. My Aristotle basil is so cute, and this one's starting to flower. I've got some more red Russian kale here that I'll be pulling out probably very soon now that the cabbage worms have showed up. This is a Paul Robeson tomato. I have wild thyme down here, a little rogue kale plant, some parsley behind the chives, and more parsley here. This is a sun gold tomato, which is a yellow cherry tomato. My calendula is blooming. Here's some more chamomile. A purple pepper plant, a ping tongue eggplant, and some thyme scattered about. This is a Better Boy tomato, and I popped some of those leftover onions in empty spaces all throughout the garden. I did a big harvest of herbs and dehydrated them this week. This is some thyme and oregano. More parsley and a raspberry bush that doesn't look super great, but compared to what it's looked like the last 2 summers, it's doing fantastic. Some more of those leftover onions and a little line of dill. These are 3 sweet pepper plants. A Yeti nasturtium. This ground cherry is starting to take off. And I have muncher cucumbers back here. These 2 are doing pretty good, but this one seems to be struggling. And it might just take off and it might die, I'm not sure. These are 2 Sapola tomato plants, and I've never grown this variety before. They are a gnarly, wild tomato plant. And this calendula next to it is about to burst with flowers. There's a little patch of peppers. This is lemon basil. Teddy bear sunflowers back there. A line of cosmos in the middle. And some okra. This silver leaf sunflower is getting huge, and it's branching out. You can see all of the little buds forming. I haven't grown a lot of sunflowers, but this one is my favorite so far. These are some sweet peppers, and under the trellis I have 3 tomato plants. A super sweet, a pork chop, and an atomic grape. I have some herbs scattered around in the empty spaces. Here's some more sweet peppers. And another silverleaf sunflower. This is 2 white borage plants in front of a sun gold tomato. My container garden corner is doing so good. I really do love growing in containers. And my green stalk is doing really great. I love that I decided to put these bush beans in here. I've got Kalima beans and dragon tongue bush beans. I am a little concerned though at the amount of shade it's casting. These beans are casting on the plants underneath, but they seem to be doing okay. This is another one of those Aristotle basil plants. I've got some hot peppers in here, but they're honestly not getting a lot of sun. So I'm not sure how well they're gonna do. And a chamomile. This is some Swiss chard. A zucchini. Some chocolate mint, and I have several cherry tomatoes in these pots. My Kalima beans are setting baby beans all over the place. This plant is just completely loaded with these French style slender green beans. Wild thyme is doing great. Here's a little pot of rosemary. I have a few plants in the ground back here in my container garden corner. This is a sugar pie pumpkin, a butternut squash, and then another sugar pie pumpkin. I have a variety of herbs sown in these pots. This is some dill coming up. Another one of those Yeti nasturtiums. Here's another one of those gnarly Sapola tomato plants, and I pruned it back a lot. Its lower branches were drooping down and touching the soil, and that's never good for a tomato plant. It just invites disease. So I trimmed that up yesterday, and it's actually good because now the herbs that I planted in the pot around that tomato are getting a little bit more sun exposure. I had to rearrange this line of pots because some of the tomato plants were getting really large and shading out others. This sun gold is beautiful and wild, and it's starting to set fruit. This is a pot of spearmint and peppermint mixed together. Most of these tomatoes I have in these pots are cherry tomato varieties. This one is an atomic grape. It's a little bigger than a cherry tomato, but still a small tomato. These are jalapeno peppers. Hi, Henry. Are you demanding some attention this morning? Another pot of those Kalima beans, just loaded with blossoms, loaded with baby beans. I'm so excited. This is a newer orange mint plant. And my little dwarf tomatoes are so precious. My little orange peppers are doing good. They're coming on in here. And I've got a Black Beauty eggplant, and it's doing so much better in this container than the eggplants I have in the soil. So I'm thinking I might just plant eggplants in containers from now on. I have 3 16-foot rows of tomato plants interplanted with onions. I did a really good job keeping record of what tomato plants were planted in these rows, and then I lost a few plants to cutworms and did not take good follow-up notes. So there are several plants in here that I do know what they are, and several plants that are kind of a mystery, but I know what I started. Once they start setting fruit, I'll be able to tell what's what. I've been tying up a lot of tomato plants lately, and this one is just so wild. It was hanging way out into the aisle. But I'm getting a lot of fruit set. Just about every tomato plant has either fruit set or blossom set. Back behind this second row of tomatoes, I have a few volunteers, and I'm pretty sure they are a cherry tomato variety because I had quite a few cherry tomatoes on this row last year. This looks like a sun gold, and I don't know if I've ever seen a branch this long. I could be wrong, maybe it's not a sun gold, but the way that it's setting fruit makes me think it is. A lot of these plants look so similar at this stage because all their blossoms are yellow, all their baby tomatoes are green. So there's really not that much to talk about yet until they start ripening. I'd say 90% of my garden was started from seed. I did pick up a fair amount of peppers because I had some poor germination rates this year. And I also grabbed some hybrid tomatoes to try. This is a sweet little line of opal basil, and I've sown some lemon basil into that as well. And that's starting to come up. There's another one of those salmon nasturtiums. I just love this plant, even without the blooms. But the blooms are awesome too. Here's some lemon thyme. My 2 potato beds back here are doing amazing. They've been setting flowers and dropping blossoms, which just means that the potatoes are forming. This is a little line of mammoth sunflowers. And on this trellis I have Chinese red noodle beans. They're slow to start, but once they get going, they'll really take off. This butternut squash, I'm sorry, not butternut. This is honey nut, so it's a miniature butternut. It should climb nicely on this trellis. This is a little patch of pro-cut sunflowers. I have both white knight and plum planted here together. My melons are just taking off. I can't believe how big some of my plants have gotten just in this past week. This is a midget melon, which is a personal size cantaloupe. This is a sugar baby watermelon. I sowed the seeds for this a lot later than the other ones because the seed that I originally planted here never germinated. Or maybe it did and got eaten right away. This is a Moon and Stars watermelon, and it's so beautiful. The watermelon will have these same yellow spots. Such an interesting plant. This is the one that was loaded with ants. I did re-sow another seed here in case this plant does not recover. But it's still hanging on. It doesn't look worse than it did, so I'm hoping that it can recover. The winter squash on this teepee trellis has more than doubled in size. I planted a few sporadic mammoth sunflowers in the corners of some of these beds. This side of the trellis is delicata squash, and these are buttercup. I had a rabbit sneak in one afternoon and it ate all of the leaves off of all of these beans that were climbing up this trellis. Some of those original plants have recovered and started new leaves, but I did sow a new line of beans and those are coming up as well. These 2 plants are more midget melons. This is a white borage and 2 sugar baby watermelon. This is a happy patch of silverleaf sunflowers and some more mammoth sunflowers. Now I realize these are planted pretty close together and they probably won't get as big as they would if they were separated and spaced out a little bit more, but I think they're going to be stunning nonetheless. Here's one of those pro-cut sunflowers. In between the mammoth sunflowers and this little line of teddy bear sunflowers, I have some parsley coming up. Behind this trellis of paste tomatoes, I sowed a dense line of calendula. These 2 summer squash are rondinese, which is a cue ball variety of zucchini. I love growing the cue ball varieties because I'm the only one that likes summer squash, and it's a perfect amount for one person. This is a little patch of zinnias, and I just cannot wait. These are some poblano peppers and some opal basil in front. This is a line of celery. I planted some pro-cut sunflowers down the center of this bed. This is another cue ball zucchini variety called Desi squash, and it's got some babies forming under there. This is a ground cherry and 3 tomato plants. My little patch of jazzy zinnias is starting to bloom. How precious. These are a little miniature zinnia variety. And this salmon nasturtium is also blooming. So pretty. These 3 tomato plants are a semi-determinate variety called Thornburg's terracotta. And as you may suspect, the tomatoes are an orange terracotta color. And I've got some sage going here, and it's doing really well. This is another white borage. I have grown the traditional purple borage. Didn't even know that there was a white variety. When I realized that, I bought seeds immediately. These are some cosmos coming up, and my little patch of snapdragons are coming along really nicely. This is like a prized possession, a little treasure in the garden. I started 250 seeds, and this is all that survived to this point. I did not have a good germination rate, and I'm sure that there's something that I can do to improve that. So I'll be looking into that for next year. This is another Rondinese summer squash, and this corner is full of that miniature zinnia, the jazzy zinnias. This calendula is filling in so nicely around these 2 silverleaf sunflowers. And this is a little patch of double click cosmos, snow cosmos. It's a white double blossom. My cucumber trellis is filling in nicely. Both sides have really taken off. This is a variety called Green Finger, and it's setting blossoms. This Armenian long is doing so great. This is my favorite cucumber. It's got a buttery texture, and if you forget to pick one and it goes a little too long on the vine, it doesn't get bitter like most varieties do. It's setting a lot of blossoms too. This little chamomile plant was struggling for a bit when I transplanted it out here, and it's finally looking like it's settling into its new home. And the celery I have going on here is looking really good. These are 3 patty pan summer squash. Down the end of both of these beds, I sowed a bunch of celery. And I know celery is tricky to get to germinate. I might start some inside just as a backup, but I'm hoping it'll sprout and do well. Thank you so much for stopping over to walk through my garden with me this morning. I'll be posting weekly garden tours throughout the growing season, and I'm having so much fun sharing my garden with you.